So Sue's talk and our Q&A session is next here. We're going to be, they provided a great foundation for our next discussion with the faculty who are actually working on diversity and equity in analytics across the Wharton School. And now I'm proud to introduce Eric Bradlow, Katherine Klein, and Stephanie Creary. Eric Bradlow is the K.P. Chow Professor of Marketing, Statistics, Education, and Economics. He's the chairperson of Wharton's Marketing Department and Vice Dean of Analytics at Wharton, one of the major sponsors of this week's event. He's an applied statistician. Professor Bradlow uses high-powered statistical models to solve problems on everything from internet search engines to product assortment issues. And specifically, his research interests include Bayesian modeling, statistical computing, and developing new methodology for unique data structures with application to business problems. I also want to introduce Stephanie Creary. She's an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School. Stephanie is an identity and diversity scholar and a field researcher. She's also the founding faculty member of the Wharton Ideas Lab. Ideas, it stands for Identity, Diversity, Engagement, Affect, and Social Relationships. She's an affiliated faculty member of Wharton People Analytics, a senior fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics, known as LDI, and affiliated faculty member of the Penn Center for Africana Studies. She leads the Leading Diversity at Wharton Speaker Series as a part of her Leading Diversity and Organization course at Wharton and hosts the Knowledge at Wharton Leading Diversity and Work podcast series. Very accomplished. And Katherine Klein, our third academic panelist, is the Edward H. Bowman Professor of Management and Vice Dean of the Wharton School of the Wharton Social Impact Initiative. She's an award-winning organizational psychologist. Katherine has conducted extensive field research, typically employing survey and qualitative data analysis to investigate a range of topics, including organizational leadership, diversity, and innovation. She is currently at work on two major research projects. The first is an examination of the effects of leadership succession on employee engagement and organizational performance. And the second is an investigation of the goals, practices, and performance of impact investing in venture capital and private equity around the world. Very, very popular topic right now as well. So without further ado, I want to welcome Eric, Stephanie, and Katherine for joining us today. Thank you very, very much. My pleasure to be here with you. So what we'd like to do is I'm going to kick it off and start with some questions for each of you. This first one, I'm going to actually direct it towards Eric, but then I'd really like both Katherine and Stephanie to comment as well. So Eric, in Sue's talk, there was discussion about mixed methods research used as a tool to promote intersectional analysis and understand both social and cultural complexity in data collection. Mixed method research involves, collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and of this quantitative and qualitative data to investigate the research question. So it's a two-part question, but this first part is, can you discuss the importance of mixed methods research and provide an example of how, in your research, how mixed methods research can be used to help companies more fully understand these challenges they seek to address. So if you could just start with that, and then we'll pivot to this intersectionality analysis.
Well, thanks, Mary. To me, mixed methods research is a great term, but it's almost become an antiquated term, and here's what I mean. We all have to do mixed methods research today, which means, we all have to generate hypotheses. Now, where do hypotheses come from? They come from past research. They come from qualitative insights. I'm a big voice of the customer person. Let's listen to the customer and see what she or he has to say about, in my case, a product or service. And what many people call mixed methods research, I call in a lot of ways data fusion, because a lot of times in the world of analytics today, we have to take textual data, which we may have gotten from web scraping or social media listening. We have to learn sentiment about it. We have to do natural language processing of it. In many ways, we're going to try to quantify that textual data, and then we're going to combine it with the standard things like transactional data, survey data, etc. So to me, mixed methods research is the future of understanding consumer behavior. And even though I'm a statistician by training and I'm a methodologist, I consider myself someone that tries to understand consumer behavior, and I don't know how you do that without qualitative insights, hypothesis generation, and the uses of multimodal types of data.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Katherine or Stephanie, with that kind of background, would you like to add to that answer that Eric was able to provide?
So I will chime in. Yeah, I will chime in and say, I truly appreciate the qualitative shout out, Eric, especially since my primary training is in qualitative research, but I have a passion for understanding how that can be transformed into quantitative insights as well. I currently have a study that I'm working on that's looking at how do you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion practices from an evidence-based standpoint. And that research actually started qualitatively with colleagues. And it started with an understanding that we need to go straight to the sources of the people who were trying to create, diversity, equity, inclusion, or I will just say DEI insights going forward. So we actually interviewed both people who consider themselves analytics experts, just like many of the people who are attending today's conference, as well as people who consider themselves people experts, right? So they specialize in diversity, equity, inclusion, HR, or talent management. And what was fascinating from this qualitative data is how much we began to understood that these two groups, the analytics people and the people, they spoke very different languages. And it was making it very difficult for them to understand how to use analytics in a smart and equitable way in their organizations to create all these outcomes that we're looking to create, such as, inclusion, for instance. And so I'm a big fan of, mixed methods research. I think it's really important, but I obviously always want to advocate for helping people to understand what you get from qualitative data. Qualitative data is not intended to, for most of us, create causal arguments. It's supposed to help you understand what's underneath the findings that you might have. And again, for me, it's also about interviewing the people who are doing the work to perhaps understand why they are making the choices that they are around the algorithms or the technology or the programs that they're creating.
Just one thing to add to what you just said, Stephanie. I had actually, when in my opening statement or remarks, I actually was thinking of using qualitative research for the initial phase in hypothesis generation, but you've brought up a more important, or at least as important, which is, so you've run some algorithm, you've gotten some finding. Why? Like, what does it actually mean? So most people, I think, erroneously only think of qualitative research as the start of the research process. My advisors always told me it's the start and the end of the research process, and then you move on to the next problem. But once you've found something analytically, you have to try to uncover why.
And I will just say one more quick thing and then pass it over to Katherine. Is so the study that I'm telling you about that we started qualitatively, we interviewed experts to understand, how they were understanding issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how they were measuring that. The later parts of our study involved fielding a survey to companies. And assessing their workforce sentiments on how they felt about inclusion and related factors. And we were getting really weird results, especially, and I say weird because based on the hypotheses and based on what we know from science, we would not have predicted any of what we found. And so I did a debrief session with all of the companies that we studied, and I said, how would you explain these results? And they had very fascinating, I will call them hypotheses, for understanding why the results might have looked different to us. And it was basically things about their culture or maybe some initiative that they just put in. And so that becomes data, and those data, those qualitative insights are going to go into our future insights. So it will enhance, it's kind of cyclical here, but it will also enhance the qualitative data as well.
So I'll chime in on a few points. This is great. And I think echoing and maybe in some cases elaborating what Eric Stephanie have said. So I'll preface this by saying that we learn a lot, we professors learn a lot by teaching, and all sorts of things we learn by teaching. And I created an assignment for my students years ago and have learned a whole lot about multi-method research from that. And the assignment is pick a topic and go and find 3 studies that exemplify what I call different ways of knowing. So one of that is an experimental study. The second is a qualitative study. And the third is what I just used. Eric might call it algorithmic or statistical. I call it simply counting and correlation. So let's take this example. Imagine I want to study how best do people learn online? Or maybe how best do people who have limited bandwidth, technological bandwidth, maybe time bandwidth, learn online? And think about what I could learn from a counting and correlation study. Like, a lot of people drop off. A lot of people don't complete. But I learn only so much. Then imagine I learn a qualitative study and I learn, it's so frustrating. I feel inadequate. I get lost. I don't understand. Or there's some comments, who knows what I'm learning from the qualitative. I get some richness. And then imagine I do an experiment. Does it make a difference if I have shorter videos? One person speaking, multiple people speaking, what is it that experiment I find? And by having students write on the same topic and find these 3 different studies, it becomes very clear what you learn from each way and the strengths and limitations of each kind. So I encourage that kind of multi-method thinking.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, Katherine. Sorry, Mary, I know you're asking the questions here, but Katherine's point is...
No, you guys are doing great. Keep going.
Katherine's point's so interesting here. So since I'm a data chaser, that's the other thing I consider myself. I chase new and interesting data. Is it because, do we need multi-method also because we just can't measure stuff? Like imagine that experiment you're talking about online. Imagine I could measure your brain waves, like, whether it's through a cap or your computer would shoot something out. Imagine I could track your eyes. Imagine you were wearing a Fitbit device so I could track your measurements on your body and how it's reacting. Would that obviate the need in your mind? Like if we really had big data, like all kinds of new data and everything you'd want to measure, would that obviate the need for this multi-method, or you see it being needed anyway?
Well, I guess one question would be, how do you make sense of that data? If you have all the data,
you come to your local statistician like me who helps you do that. That's what I do.
Yeah, right. It's tricky though, right? Because what you're going to find, of course, is that all these things are super highly correlated, but then some things aren't. So I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to imagine that world. We're getting closer, but it's hard to imagine. You track my feet and you know how fast I'm running and what my heart rate is. But do you know if I'm feeling good about myself? Because, man, I did so well and I ran farther today than ever before. Or, man, I set higher goals, but you didn't know that and I'm actually frustrated. Like, when you can read my mind and my heart and all my behavior, then yeah, maybe that'll work. We'll be a little frightened by that possibility. But we're moving forward on those things. I still think the challenge of making sense of the data will remain, right? It will really remain.
And to that point, Katherine, in making sense of the data, I think you've all touched upon it and articulated so well, is that everyone really needs to understand this whole concept that Sue brought up, which is, and you all have commented on very strongly, is this, mixed method research, this, the intersectionality of analysis, and how there's more and more overlays across researchers and starting with qualitative, inserting quantitative, maybe ending with qualitative, the different methods. You just continually need to look outside your own areas of expertise and begin to insert that because of all the complex questions we're starting to answer. So I'm going to shift a little bit. Thank you very much for that very engaging topic. We probably could have spent, another 10, 20 minutes on that. We're going to shift a little bit, and I'm going to start with Stephanie. So Sue mentioned, Sue also discussed inviting diverse voices in data collection and how that can help, address bias in algorithms. So my question is, with so much attention being paid to bias in algorithms, what do you think needs to be done both in the short term and long term to address these concerns? And then also potentially, can organizations adopt to better inform their algorithms to create more equitable outputs? And I'm going to put a little bit of a caveat, if you could project this for those in the audience that are also, within organizations and companies. I mean, I like the academic hat, but if we could just push that out, this particular area for companies, if that's all right, and organizations.
Yeah, so the good news is that I teach undergraduate and MBA students at Wharton and Penn this topic in my diversity, equity, inclusion classes, and they appreciate when I talk at the level of company examples. So I'm going to take a tip from them as I sort of try to help us simplify this rather complex topic. So my specialty is in understanding workplace behavior and experiences. So much of my expertise around understanding bias in algorithms and bias in systems is how they show up in workplace processes. So the example that I'm going to use just to help us all through this is talent management systems. So what that is when we think about our recruiting and our hiring processes and our promotion processes, and how are these decisions made about whose resumes we're going to look at, who's going to get an interview, who's going to be hired, et cetera, who's going to be promoted. So these are all very critical talent management decisions that are very consequential. We're determining someone's future in our organization, and obviously that has implications for life, right? Our capacity to just be contributors to society. So it's really important that we get it right when we're making talent management decisions. Well, what happens is, either way that we look at it, whether we're looking at a manager making decisions about people's hiring processes, or whether they will be hired or not, we're looking at how they're being evaluated for a promotion or a raise, or whether we look at the algorithm. Research looking at both entities, both sources of decision making, shows that there are inherent biases in these processes. And so what companies are trying to do right now is they're trying to figure out how do we think about human judgment and the decisions that are made via algorithms, how do we think of these as complements for one another, not as substitutes? And so what has happened in this conversation for a long time, it was the algorithm's better than humans, we're just going to advance that and let's not let people make their own decisions, until lots of research started coming out to say that, well, humans are deciding which data are being used to determine what we're feeding into the algorithm, and they're deciding the decision points that the algorithm is making. Okay, so that's just sort of baseline what the tension is. So what needs to be done in the short term and the long term is for organizations and people who are part of these processes, such as analytics leaders and people who work on analytics teams and people who work on HR, talent, and DEI teams, to begin to work together in order to figure out how do we effectively mitigate or reduce biases in these decision processes. Now, I've already told you that we have different expertise at play. So it's a little bit hard sometimes to use language, just like I'm trying to use practical language when I'm an academic, right? It is very hard, we have found, for analytics people and the people experts to get on the same page, but it is possible. And so what the recommendations are for the short term and the long term is to create, first of all, to acknowledge that whatever we're creating, algorithmically or just from a standpoint of AI broadly, it's emergent, which means there's always room for improvement. And I think about this like science, because it is data science, right? When I write a paper, I know probably 6 months later, a year later, somebody's going to write a paper that says more than I did when I wrote my paper. That's the nature of the iterative and the evolutionary nature of what we do. But I think sometimes in organizations, there's a resistance to I would say, adjusting the algorithm to suit the new information that is coming in. And the new information, by what I mean new information coming in, I mean our understanding that the algorithm may not be as predictive as we might want it to be. So then how do we adjust? So I would say the first step is really just acknowledging that the tools can always be improved. The second step is actually auditing the process. So let's say we have a couple of cases where we've used the algorithm. How do we go back and examine not only from the start what data were used, what decision points were made, what criteria were used to be predictive of this person being hired versus that person, but at the end, based on who got chosen, how do we understand who got left out? So from a DEI standpoint, whether it's humans or algorithms making decisions, we're always curious to know So was it skewed? Do we have more applicants from this process that skew heavily male versus female? Are they more American versus international? Are they people of color versus white? And how does that potentially shape what the output is, who eventually gets the job? So these become ways of thinking about creating processes and checking it and auditing it throughout the process so that we're beginning to understand that as humans who are creating algorithms and all the technology, we're still subject to the same, I would say, preferences and biases and limited information that we would be subject to if we were actually just making decisions. So I'm going to pause there. I could clearly go on, but I just wanted to give us a little bit more foundational understanding of how something as critical as data and decisions and process is even more important when we're starting to think about technology.
That was a great basis, Katherine. Do you want to add on to that, especially in the auditing process, and I thought that was very important there as well.
I mean, I would just echo what Stephanie said. I'm wondering, Mary, you're gonna have to tell us on what our time limitations are and how much time we have to go on. A piece I would add that's related, and as I think about analytics, I just want to make a shout out for academic research that's already been done on so many topics, and the importance. I mean, it sort of goes back to our prior conversation, our prior discussion. We have so many topics where there is really sound research by sociologists, psychologists, economists, and others studying the same phenomena. And by learning those, looking at the existing literature, there's just a tremendous amount to learn from what we already know in the research literature. It's maybe the flip side or a compliment to what Stephanie has said about always improving is also making sure that we're learning from what's already been done. And I could provide specifics, but I want to make sure that we have time to close up the session and get this timing right. So I won't go on now.
Yeah, we have just like a time for about two more questions, and so Katherine, I'd like to give you an opportunity to answer this one first. We've been talking a lot about these data collection efforts in terms of promoting diversity and equity and inclusion. So potentially, could you highlight what you have for data analytic leaders in terms of how they incorporate DEI in their data collection and analysis? And I don't know if you want, definitely highlight one of these specific pieces of research around analytics for good that you're really excited about as well.
Well, I think there's it's a broad and important question. Let me kind of flag two things that come to mind that are related to my work and my teaching. There's so many different areas, but that I'll highlight. One, when it comes to impact investing and ESG and investing, there are a lot of challenges. I would just say there is a hope for great data, for great analysis, and for being able to compare what is the impact of my investment into solar lighting, into girls' education, into carbon footprint reduction, into employment practices, and wow. Apples to oranges and pears and tires, whatever it is, just so difficult to have rigorous analysis. So I think maybe this is a call out for, as we think about impact, let's also think about, let's be realistic. Let's avoid hype in what we're able to show. Let's avoid window dressing, exaggerating on the rigor of our data analysis, because these are really very difficult challenges. Another area where I think there's so much to learn, and I've been really impressed by the huge quantity of data that we have, is an area I've been digging into in my teaching and work around incarceration, around policing, around reentry and returning citizens. I would just say there's a tremendous amount of research that's been done. It's fascinating, it's complex, it's eye-opening, and as these topics are in the news, I would just really encourage people to look at the existing research because we know a tremendous amount. I would also say that in this country, and here's where policy and analytics and impact kind of intersect, when it comes to policing, and to the prison system, incarceration in this country, again, getting lots and lots of news, there are tremendous barriers to data collection and data analysis because our systems are so decentralized. So it just, again, speaks to there's so much we can learn from analytics and research, and I'm a huge believer in the power of all this, and I think we need to be mindful of the limitations and the challenges.
Well, thank you, Katherine. Let me just say this has been a great and enjoyable panel for me. When I was listening to both you and Stephanie, I must admit my first thought was, be careful what you optimize. Like, what is it that you're optimizing? And I think just Katherine, listening to you, it better be multidimensional, because if we think there's a single dimensional objective function that if I jam, and this is relating to a Stephanie's example, if I jam the right inputs in, I know exactly who to hire. Well, that's a single dimensional output. It's a nonsensical question to ask, and we can do better. Analytics can think about, so what's the impact on society? What's the impact on the firm? What's the impact on teamwork? What's the impact on profits? There's lots of different ways to think about it. So I want to thank both of you, Stephanie and Katherine and Mary, for leading us in this discussion. And I guess one of my honors as Vice Dean of Analytics at Wharton is that I get to wrap up and close the event for all of us. So let me just do that with a few seconds here. First, again, thank you to Katherine and Stephanie for a great session today. We actually have 250 registrants that have actually participated over the course of the week, which is just amazing. I mean, everyone's COVIDed out and, Zoomed out at this point, but we had over 250 people. We hosted live speakers, technical workshops, on-demand content, network sessions, which I ran one of on Wednesday, and all within the virtual environment. I will say to you that, like live, do not worry. We have full expectations and hopes that we will be back in 2022 in person and virtual, so if you'd like a hybrid format. We appreciate your engagement throughout the week. My new motto for 2021-2022 is let's make analytics an action word. Let's analytics it. And so hopefully all of you have learned something that you can actually take back to your firm. As mentioned by Mary, and Maddie has mentioned this as well, all of you will have access to the portal until May the 14th, so that's for the next week or so. That means all of the recorded content, all of the on-demand content, etc. Please take advantage of that. And of course, if you want to stay abreast with everything that's going on at Analytics at Wharton, I strongly encourage all of you to bookmark and go to our website, analytics.wharton.upenn.edu. And just two last things. One is when you close out of Blue Jeans, there'll be a 2-minute survey. We're in the continuous improvement business, so please help us give you a better experience now and in future events. And last but not least, on behalf of the Wharton School, on behalf of our Dean, Erica James, thank you for attending. I hope you now consider yourself part of the Analytics at Wharton family, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you again.